Imagine waking up one morning, and by sunset, 3 of your neighbors are dead. The next day, 5 more. Within a week, half your village is gone. No warning, no explanation, no cure, just death, moving from house to house like it's picking names off a list. This wasn't a nightmare. This was daily life in Europe between 1347 and 1352, during the deadliest pandemic in human history, the Black Death. It killed an estimated 30 million people in Europe alone, and many more across Asia and North Africa. Some historians believe it wiped out as much as half the entire population of the continent. So here's the real question. If you were an ordinary person living through this, no modern medicine, no understanding of germs, no vaccines, how did you actually survive? What did people do when the deadliest disease in history showed up at their door? That's what we're covering today. Let's start with what people were actually dealing with. The Black Death was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on rats. Those infected fleas would bite humans, and the bacteria would spread through the bloodstream, causing painful swollen lymph nodes called buboes, which is where the name bubonic plague comes from. In its most severe forms, the infection could spread to the lungs or bloodstream, and death could come within just a few days of the first symptoms appearing. But here's the critical part. Nobody in the 14th century knew any of this. The bacterium responsible for the plague wasn't identified until 1894, more than 500 years later. So medieval people were fighting an invisible enemy with absolutely no idea what it actually was. Without science to explain it, people reached for the only frameworks they had: religion and superstition. Many believed the plague was a punishment from God for the sins of humanity. Others blamed the alignment of the planets. A popular medical theory at the time was that disease spread through miasma, literally bad air. If a place smelled foul, it was assumed to be dangerous. This belief, even though based on a wrong theory, actually pushed some communities toward genuinely useful behavior, like avoiding waste and improving basic sanitation, even if the reasoning behind it was completely off. Now let's talk about what people actually tried to do to protect themselves. Some of it was pure superstition. People carried flowers or wore perfumed gloves to try to ward off the bad air they believed was spreading the sickness. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, believing that draining bad blood would restore balance to the body. Some treatments were bizarre by modern standards. One documented method involved cutting up a live chicken and pressing pieces of it against a patient's plague sores, based on the belief that chickens breathe through a different part of their body and could somehow draw the infection out. If the chicken died, they'd simply grab another one and repeat the process. None of this did anything to help, and some of it likely made things worse by introducing more infection into open wounds. Then there were the plague doctors, the ones you've probably seen in old paintings, wearing long black robes and a mask shaped like a bird's beak. That beak wasn't decoration. It was stuffed with dried flowers, herbs, and strong-smelling substances, because doctors believed breathing through a beak full of pleasant smells would filter out the bad air causing the disease. They had no idea the real threat was the fleas riding on the rats scurrying through the same streets they walked every day. But here's something important. Out of everything medieval society tried, only one method actually worked, and it's one we're all deeply familiar with now: quarantine. The port city of Ragusa, which is modern-day Dubrovnik in Croatia, became one of the first places in the world to formally implement a quarantine system. Starting in 1377, authorities required ships and travelers arriving from plague-affected areas to isolate for 30 days before being allowed into the city, a period that was later extended to 40 days. That number 40 wasn't random. In medieval Christian tradition, 40 carried deep religious symbolism. 40 days and nights of rain during the biblical flood, 40 days Jesus spent fasting in the wilderness. That's actually where the word quarantine comes from. It's derived from the Italian phrase quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. Cities like Venice adopted similar practices, isolating incoming ships before allowing passengers ashore. Some cities went even further, establishing what were called pest houses or plague hospitals. dedicated locations outside city walls where infected individuals could be kept separate from the healthy population. Officials also restricted large public gatherings and limited funeral processions, trying to reduce the number of people clustering together in close contact. None of these officials understood germ theory. They had no concept of bacteria or viruses, but through pure observation, noticing that the disease seemed to spread fastest wherever people gathered closely together, they landed on a strategy that modern science would later prove genuinely effective. It's honestly remarkable. Some historians consider Ragusa's quarantine law one of the most advanced achievements of medieval public health, centuries ahead of when we'd actually understand why it worked. Of course, just like today, not everyone followed the rules. Wealthier families often had the means to simply leave the cities entirely, fleeing to remote country estates where they could isolate in comfort, which ironically sometimes helped spread the disease even further into rural areas that had previously been untouched. Others ignored quarantine measures altogether, continuing to attend crowded religious services, insisting that prayer and faith would offer more protection than isolation ever could. And that's another major thread running through this entire story: the religious response. The church taught that the plague was divine punishment for human sin, and that penance, prayer, and public processions were the way to convince God to lift the punishment. This belief gave rise to extreme groups known as flagellants, people who would travel from town to town publicly whipping themselves in acts of religious penance, hoping to atone for the sins they believed had brought the plague upon them. It's a haunting image: crowds of desperate, terrified people inflicting pain on themselves, convinced it might be the only thing standing between them and death. Unsurprisingly, marching in large groups from town to town while sharing close quarters likely helped spread the very disease they were trying to escape. So with all of this, the superstition, the flawed medicine, the desperate religious rituals, how did anyone survive at all? Some of it really did come down to the early quarantine and isolation practices working better than anyone at the time even realized. Communities that isolated faster and more strictly generally suffered less severe outbreaks than those that didn't. Simple, practical steps also helped without people fully understanding why. Boiling water, disposing of waste further from living spaces, culling stray animals that might be carrying disease, avoiding overcrowded areas when possible. And then there's a factor almost nobody at the time could have understood: pure biological luck. Modern science now believes that some individuals carried a degree of natural genetic resistance to the bacteria responsible for the plague. Some people were exposed and simply never got sick. Others caught the disease and somehow survived it, while people around them, seemingly just as strong and healthy, did not. At the time, this must have felt completely random and terrifying. There was no way to know who was safe and who wasn't. Today, we understand that not everyone's immune system responds to a given pathogen the same way, and that some of those medieval survivors likely had biological advantages their neighbors simply didn't. Think about what that means on a human level. You could do everything right by medieval standards: pray, isolate, burn incense, avoid crowds, and still get sick and die within days. Or you could do everything wrong, ignore every precaution, and somehow walk away completely untouched. There was no fairness to it, no clear cause and effect that anyone alive at the time could actually observe. That uncertainty is arguably the most terrifying part of the entire pandemic. Not just the death toll, but the complete inability to understand who was at risk and why. By the time the initial wave of the Black Death subsided in Europe around 1352, the world it left behind looked completely different. With such a massive percentage of the population gone, labor became scarce, which shifted economic power toward peasants and workers in ways that hadn't existed before. Entire social and economic structures that had stood for centuries began to crack under the pressure. Some historians argue the Black Death indirectly helped set the stage for the eventual decline of feudalism across Europe. And the plague didn't just disappear after that first wave. Outbreaks continued to resurface in the decades and even centuries that followed, hitting cities like Ragusa again in 1391 and 1397, proving just how difficult this disease was to fully contain, even with quarantine measures already in place. Looking back at all of this now, what's striking isn't just how much people suffered. It's how much of their response, flawed as it was, actually mirrors what we still do today. Isolating the sick, limiting large gatherings, restricting travel from affected areas. These weren't concepts invented in the modern era. They were being tested, argued over, and slowly refined more than 600 years ago by people who had absolutely no understanding of what a bacterium even was. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't have vaccines. They didn't even have a basic concept of how disease actually spread from one person to another. And yet, through nothing but observation and desperation, they landed on a strategy that still forms the backbone of how we handle outbreaks today. So the next time you hear someone dismiss the past as primitive or unsophisticated, remember this. Faced with the worst pandemic in recorded history, with none of the tools we take for granted today, medieval society still managed to figure out the one thing that actually worked. Not through science, through pure, hard-earned trial and error. If you found this as fascinating as I did, stick around, because this is exactly the kind of history I cover every week. The parts of the past that feel less like distant history and more like a mirror held up to how humans actually behave under pressure. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.